Welcome to another podcast, The Black Dog Confessional. Christopher?
What was that, Steven? What was that?
I don't know.
You just decide you're going to change your voice?
That was did I really?
Yeah,
did I have a radio voice?
Welcome to another episode of The Black Dog Confessional.
Oh my gosh, I had the Kelly Simpkins radio voice.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh man, I'll try it again.
Sound like you're a shock jock.
Okay.
Whoa.
So stupid. Well, welcome to another podcast, The Black Dog Confessional. That was Redbird, obviously. We're going to hit a topic today that has been affecting this county for a very long time. We're going to talk about addiction. And to do that, I brought a friend of mine on. We'll call her Susan. No, I'm joking. But I brought my friend Susan on, and we're going to talk about addiction because this is something she's lived through. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of thought that people have about addiction. And we're going to kind of go through that today to kind of dispel some things and offer ways that you can get help. And there's a lot of parents out there that have a lot of questions, and trust me, I hear them all the time. And the easiest way for me to explain it is to have somebody who's lived through it explain it. So I want to welcome Susan to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No worries. I talked about Susan in a podcast with Chris. Was that podcast 3 with Keisel? Sure. Okay.
So you guys are talking behind my back.
We were, but it was all good things. I basically, Chris was talking about, I had to mention addiction, and one of the things I brought up was that I knew you, and that I fully believe that you are an incredibly brilliant human being.
Thank you.
And there's so many people out there who have a mentality of what an addict is or what a recovered addict looks like, and those are all bogus. And you're a prime example of moving out of that phase and the thought process of recovery. So I kind of wanted you to start by telling your story, how it all started, and how you found your way out of it.
Okay. All right. Well, to start out with, I just want to say I'm really nervous. This is not the format that I'm used to, and I say thank you for having me out, but this is like very nerve-wracking. It's a little terrifying because it goes against everything I've ever learned. Like, at least for most of my life, like those feelings that are so uncomfortable, like you want to avoid them, you want to, don't talk about them, cover them up, hide them, and when I start to talk about addiction, that's just becoming completely vulnerable. So it helps for me to acknowledge those feelings when I start something like this, because then it brings me in the moment. It kind of gets me out of my head, and it just, it kind of honors those human feelings that I've avoided my whole life.
Absolutely.
But when I was little, I didn't know how to manage all those feelings. Like there were some things early on that I did not have the ability to cope with. There was some early childhood trauma, some sexual things that happened when I was like 4 and 5 years old. And, those are my earliest memories. That's how my story starts. And, it breaks my heart for like me as a child to think that, I had to go through that stuff. And it wasn't my parents' fault. It wasn't for lack of love. Like there was always love in my house. There was always food on the table, but I was so little, I didn't know how to ask for help, and the things that were happening, that was the beginning of my disease, because, there was these things that I knew were morally incorrect, they weren't morally sound that I was going through as a little kid, and I had that awareness, but from a biological standpoint, there were some things that felt okay, I liked them, and that's the beginning of my story, like me knowing that like something is inherently wrong with me, and trying to deal with that, and so the very first way I learned how to cope with it was to overexcel in school. So I started to learn how to like please the teachers, how to get good grades, how to get that pat on the back, and for someone else to tell me like, you're doing good, you're doing well, and that's how I got some self-worth. That's how I could kind of escape that idea that like, as a little kid, I'm a monster, and I thought that, as soon as I found out what suicide was, like, that's what I wanted. I didn't know about drugs at that point. I didn't know about like getting help. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't want to exist, and I was a baby. And I remember that. I remember being like severely depressed in kindergarten, and I look at the little kids in my life, like I have nieces and nephews, and bless their sweet little hearts. I could not imagine anyone going through that, but the blessing today is that, like, I can have some compassion for that part of myself. Like, I can, try to do some inner child work and just care for, I'll let myself go out and have fun. And, I try to be playful. I have, I really nurture my creativity. I do whatever I can to try to take care of that part of me that's still that little kid inside, because I didn't get that when I was little. I didn't know how to do that for myself. So I was excelling in school and, very shy, did not know how to make friends, couldn't reach out. I had like maybe one or two friends and my brother. And, I socially, I wanted to be part of, I always wanted to be part of, but I always felt like I was just an outcast. And, excelling in class, that didn't help at all. You don't want to be the teacher's pet and try to make friends. Like, that just wasn't happening for me. And in 6th grade, it all kind of came to a head where, the hormones are hitting. And then my teacher, I guess they could tell something was going on with me. And they pulled me out of class and they did some testing and they wanted to put me in the gifted program. And so naturally, my way of coping with that, it seems like something good, but it was an extra stress in my life. I felt like that severed me from the rest of the class body. And so that was right when I started using drugs, in 6th grade, little kid. In elementary school, I was getting high on the playground, right here in town. And it was only because I overheard some other kids saying that they were going to get high and they knew I was going to tell. And I was like, no, I do that every day. And I'd never done it in my life, but that was like my in.
Right.
And that was a very profound moment in my life when I don't remember getting high at first. I just remember like being part of, it was like I had finally arrived, like I had finally found this social in.
The feeling of acceptance.
Yeah, when I couldn't accept myself. And, at one point it was just, my parents that would accept me sometimes and the teachers. And then all of a sudden it was my peers.
Yeah.
And that was huge to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things we see is there's a lot of people that are looking for that acceptance, that they follow the same path as you. And, just continue on because like you're hitting so many things that, I think a lot of parents think about, when they see their kid going through similar stuff and they're like, well, maybe they're introverted or maybe they're just not that social. And, they worry, do they feel accepted? Are they excelling anywhere? What is bringing them to this point where maybe they're acting depressed or are having suicidal thoughts? And, a good friend of Gabriel's committed suicide last year at 16,
Mm-hmm.
and, this was a kid that I looked at as, man, the kid had it all together. And I watched him play baseball, and a few hours later he committed suicide. And I would have never have thought that was going to happen, but there's things that people wonder, like what was going on. And like you've already explained where this started and how young you were, that this wasn't something that just started at age 11. This is something that started much younger. Mm-hmm. So please continue.
Yeah, and it wasn't just like this awareness, like, these things that happened when I was 4 and 5, like those made me feel a certain way, and I don't feel like I fit in socially. It wasn't like I was cognizant of what was going on. Yeah. It was just this overwhelming, looming dark cloud that always followed me, where like something was always off. Like I was always crawling inside of my skin. Like, when you're sitting on your foot wrong and you get that like tingling feeling from your circulation, like that was my spirit, all the time. And it didn't go away right away when I started using drugs. Like I still felt a lot of that, but it was those moments of reprieve when I could, we would skip school or I'd meet someone before school or after school, and I'd, lie to my parents about what I was doing and just be able to kind of have this little escape. And that's how it really started for me. It was like little escape by little escape, and then it turned into like, we used to have this DARE class, and they gave us these little books. I think they were coloring books, and they had all these pictures. And there was a guy in the alley on the side of the road, or like on the side of a building, and that's what a junkie looked like. And then I remember the picture of a joint, and that's how I rolled my first joint, was from the DARE book. That was my reference, because I know how to study, and that's not even a lie. I had gotten some drugs, and I wanted to bring it to school, and I didn't know you were supposed to do certain things to it. So there was like stems and seeds and everything in there. And I looked at the picture, and I tried to make it wrinkled just like it did in my DARE book. And that's how I studied it. That was my first little in, not to knock the DARE program, because my DARE officer, actually, he watched me grow up, and he interrogated me at one point in my disease, and when I got clean, I got to go thank him.
That's awesome.
For his job. But these things, all the drugs that we went over that I learned about, and I knew, like, you try this one the first time and you're going to be hooked, and it's just going to be, like, that was the idea that I got. Like, as soon as you did this one thing, your life would be over. And I started to try one substance and another, and they started to get worse, and I realized, like, I'm invincible. Like, this stuff isn't, I can handle this. And the fear went away, and then my life just became, this is what I need to do. And I was trying to balance going to school, because I still wanted to be that overachiever. And then I overachieved in my drug addiction. So it was like, it was so hard to manage, like, hiding the drugs from my parents, hiding the high grades from my friends who were druggies, because it wasn't cool. Anytime we were getting high, like, I would try to talk about, microbiology and things that I thought were neat, and they just tell me shut up. Like, that was not acceptable. Like, nobody wanted, like, a science lecture in the middle of getting high. That was a total buzzkill. So it was always trying to deal with this duality of, like, the good parts of myself and like the so-called bad parts, and I felt like my life was completely unmanageable. And that was in my teenage years. That was before I even got out of high school. And it went from, like, being able to party on the weekends or after school to, like, during school to all day, every single day, like, falling asleep in class. I had big dreams. I never planned on becoming a drug addict. Those weren't, I wanted to, I wanted to go to college. I wanted to get these college degrees. I wanted to learn things and go places. And that's not how it went. Like, I look at people, like, I know a lot of families who have loved ones who are struggling, and it's like it's so easy to be disappointed by the drug addict. It's so easy. I can't imagine what my family went through, because on the outside it looks like a lot of choices. And I'm not saying that I don't have responsibility for the choices that I made, because I definitely, like, nobody ever held me down and made me do drugs. Like these were things that I wanted to do. And I didn't understand the disease of addiction. So then it was like, my life starting to spiral downhill. It got to the point where, like, I couldn't handle my AP classes in my senior year. Like, my father was diagnosed with cancer, and I didn't know how to deal with that. This was the man of the house who was usually working, and all of a sudden, he was falling apart. And, like, within the span of a year, he was diagnosed, and then he died. So, like, that year was just completely, it was the most trauma I had experienced to that date. And so, I dropped out of school, and my disease, it just, as soon as my father died, like, I remember being, like, absolutely devastated when he passed away, and at the same time, like, wishing that the hospice nurses didn't take him so quickly, because I wanted to go find the drugs that he had. Like, I knew he had prescription medication, and knowing that, like, that was one of my main concerns when my father passed away. Like, where was this stuff, and why didn't I get to it quick enough, and having that awareness of myself, like, I felt more like a monster. And then it's just this snowball where it's like these feelings that I have to cover up. And the more that I try to cover it up, the worse decisions I make, the more I compromise my own morals. And it's like this losing battle that I just can't get out of, because you just have to keep piling on more drugs and more things to take away that pain that's self-imposed, completely self-imposed. And I didn't know that, like, the disease of addiction is what was fueling this. And I didn't think that there was ever a solution to that. It was just me being like inherently wrong. It was that idea from when I was a kid, except as a kid, I didn't really have a lot of evidence. There were some things that happened, that I held on to, but like once I became a young adult and I had dedicated, 8, 9, 10 years of my life doing drugs and hurting people and hurting myself and making these bad decisions, then it was like I had all the evidence I ever needed to say like I'm unworthy of love, like to really verify these ideas, these belief systems that I had inside myself, where like I'm unworthy of love, I'm inherently damaged, the decisions that I make are wrong, I'm bad, and like how do you fix that?
No, I mean that's that's how old were you at that time? Like 17, 18?
I was 18 when my father passed away.
So I mean, I just want everybody to understand this is when somebody's still in high school. This has all transpired in one person's life, and this is one person that represents probably thousands across the U.S. That their story. And if you think back in time, past, present, future, I mean, your story is one of millions probably. That people have been put through the same situations, the feelings of self-worth issues maybe, that how do I get accepted? How do I become part of the group? Because I think that's what we see a lot on TV, we see in stories, that if you want to be cool, you have to be this or you have to be that. We've steered away from self-development, personal development. How do we take the individual and make them grow? We try to lump everybody into one thing, and we say this is your framework for how you get to be this or how you get to be that. And that's not necessarily true. There's a million paths to get to the same result. When you were 18 years old, I remember I've heard Susan speak before, and one of the things that really hit me was the story about when your father passed, and the thought process you had about, man, I really wanted to get to his meds. And I think that says a lot about the addiction, about what's going on there, because you loved your father. Mm-hmm. Absolutely loved your father.
Absolutely.
And like anybody else in this room who's ever lost a loved one, you feel that pain, but at the same time, in the back of your head, there is this thought about the medications that he had for his pains from passing of cancer. And I think that goes a long way with what a lot of people have seen over the years. They fall. I'll bring it back to, and we'll throw his name out, Dr. John Gayden, when he was over on Beachside. And you have a guy who's prescribing more prescription opiates in 1 year than the entire state of California did. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, there's a line wrapped around his building. He's taking $300 cash and giving people 90 oxys or 90 whatever. And it continues that addiction. And I think what we saw when prescription pills came into play were that people, it crossed the line. We always used to say that on that side of the tracks is the bad side of the tracks. Don't go to that side of the tracks. There's cocaine and stuff over there. And then there were the people that kind of hung around the middle of the tracks, maybe smoking some weed or whatever. And there's on the other side of the tracks who didn't do anything. Well, when prescription pills came in, it kind of crossed all borders, crossed all barriers. We would see the quote-unquote soccer moms that had Xanax habits, prescription pill habits, that realistically those are synthetic opiates. No different than shooting heroin, the same detox issues. When we first started, working in law enforcement, I started seeing a lot of these cases come in where people who had never been in trouble, they're 40 years old, and now they're stealing credit cards, and they're using the credit cards to buy groceries because the money that they're getting from their employment, they're using on buying prescription pills. Because their addiction had gotten the best of them. And that's not something that was part of their normal behavior. That was part of the addiction. That's what changed in their behavior. When we get back, we're going to touch base on the family and moving forward out of that and the family support section of it. We'll be right back.
Jesse, have you ever wondered What is the best way to interview applicants for your open position so you have the best chance of hiring a keeper?
All the time.
Well, I talk to managers every day, Jesse, that use their gut instinct to make a hire. Sometimes that works out, but more times than not, it can lead to a bad hire. Replacing a poor hire can be expensive and hurt morale. One of our most popular service offerings at HR Office Savers is teaching employers how to be better interviewers. Improved interviewing techniques lead to better hiring, which leads to better employee retention, which leads to less turnover and more profit. Contact me today to find out how you can learn to be a better interviewer. I can be reached online at www.hrofficesavers.com or by phone 928-308-4506. Again, that's 928-308-4506. 928-308-4506.
Hey, Lightning!
What's up, sunshine?
I am so excited about our new show.
Oh, yeah? Well, what are we going to talk about? Real estate?
Of course.
How to get a mortgage?
Yep, for first-timers and experienced owners.
What about the best place to get a drink on the beach?
Lightning, come on. Who would know better than us?
All right, I dig it. Plus, I know we're going to bring in tons of great local guests, tell jokes, and talk about some of the hottest listings to hit the market.
Oh my god, I can't wait. Sunshine and Lightning over Brevard will have new shows every Sunday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, streaming live from the beautiful Space Coast Podcast Studios.
And make sure you like our Facebook page, Sunshine and Lightning, Exit First Class Realty, and subscribe to Space Coast Podcast to make sure you don't miss out on any of our new shows.
Dig it.
All right, boom.
You're listening to Space Coast Podcast, home of the greatest podcasts on the Space Coast. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor or having your own show, email us at spacecoastpodcast@hotmail.com.
Space Coast Podcast.
Talk hard!
All right, we are back. Chris, what are your thoughts so far?
So we were kind of talking a little bit during the break, and I have an 8-year-old daughter, and you're always taught and looking at other parents and people who've gone through addiction and drug use, and you think, okay, well, all you have to do is love your kid, tell them that you love them, support them, make sure they know that they're loved, and they'll be 100% fine. But listening to your story and talking to you a little bit in the break, that sounds exactly how your family was, how you were growing up.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of, it's hard because, again, we were talking during the break, everybody's so different, and all these start so different and go different ways. And I just don't know how, as a parent, what you do to make sure that your child doesn't fall victim or go down that path.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no, perfect way of predicting it.
Right.
Like, some of us just end up picking the short straw, we're goose in that little circle, and it would be nice to know ahead of time and take some preemptive measures, to maybe avoid it or prevent it, but it's not one of those things that's preventable. I think that as addicts, some of us we feel too much, and I think that was a big part of my addiction, is just having all these feelings and not knowing how to cope with them.
Now, we stopped. You were 18 at that time. Your father had just passed. What happened from the time you were 18 on till your point of stepping into towards recovery?
Well, that's when it gets interesting. Or at around 18,
I don't know if I'm ready for this.
Yeah, I don't know if I am either. Go back to commercial. Before my father passed away, I had gotten into a relationship, and really nice guy. We were together for about 6 or 7 years and engaged. Unfortunately, we weren't on the same page with addiction. He didn't think I should, kill myself slowly on a daily basis, and I thought he was a jerk for that. So, he just kind of got in the way of my using, and that's why our relationship eventually ended. He would come home from work, and I was high, and my eyes were red, and he'd say, like, what's going on, and I told him, like, you're just a jerk, like, you're so overbearing, and just completely deflect everything that I was going through. And I've been good at that. Like, I don't want to take any responsibility for my own disease, and so I would just, it was my parents' fault. They were overbearing. It was my boyfriend's fault. It was, it was so easy to point outside of me because I had all this pain inside, and I didn't know how to take responsibility. I didn't know how to I was not empowered to make a change. And so it was so much easier just point outside, blame somebody else. And I know that's a hard part of addiction when the problem is so obvious to everyone else, but I've stayed in denial for so long, such a long time in my life that, it ended up causing a lot of pain. So got that relationship out of the way, and my addiction, my father wasn't in the picture, my fiance was gone, and my disease just completely spiraled downhill. Like, there was no one for me to hold me accountable. Like, my mother, she just wanted to keep me alive. She would come into the bathroom and see me knotted out on the toilet. She didn't know that I could have asphyxiated, and died just from the way I was passed out. She'd find me on the couch. She'd find me, with drug paraphernalia and stuff all over her house. My mother is the sweetest woman. And I swear she was my angel that kept me alive. It's so hard to draw that line between what is enabling and what's keeping a loved one just breathing. And I know my mom was that angel for me. I put her through so much. And it wasn't fair. I had everyone in my family sending me letters saying, you got to stop. Something's got to change. I even had a family member tell me, if I was homeless, they wouldn't even let me stay on their couch. They said I was killing my mother, and killing myself. And at the time, I took that very personally. I thought everyone completely abandoned me. My brother, he didn't want anything to do with me. It got so bad that and he was my best friend growing up. I didn't have a lot of friends, but my brother and I were a year apart. He was always there. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have my dad, I didn't have my fiance, and my brother, he moved away, and they wouldn't even tell me where they moved. And that broke my heart. It absolutely broke my heart, and I would just point my finger and lash out at them. But I know, in retrospect, now that I've gotten clean, I just hung out with my brother and my nephew today. They were playing paintball, and I have the security code to his house. I can go over there anytime I want. We're very close, and I can see that he had to sever that. He had to sever that relationship. And I'm so thankful that there were some people in my life that told me they weren't going to co-sign me killing myself. They weren't going to stick around for that. That was a huge deal for me.
Absolutely. No, that's interesting. You said that the co-sign you killing yourself. I mean, that's very real. That's very real.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone was falling off. I didn't have any family. It was just my mother, and she was basically just, she just provided for what I needed. It wasn't I was being a good daughter. I was just showing up at the house, messed up all the time, doing drug deals in and out of her house, probably watched by the cops all the time. I know that I was. And, my mother's handicapped. She's such a wonderful woman. She's the sweetest lady you'll ever meet. You look at her and you wouldn't think that her house was a dope hole.
No.
But that's
I don't think I've ever seen a woman not smiling.
Yeah. She's always smiling, always happy. So, I completely wrecked her house, and I did what I wanted, and it went from having the resources. I held down a job from. I babysat when I was younger, and then 15 I got a job, and I usually had employment, and then my fiance, he made a good bit of money, so I always had a way to pay for my drugs. And then I was selling drugs on the side, and I could always provide, but it got to the point where you couldn't satiate that thirst that I had for any chemicals. I could never get enough. And it got to where I found out that I could get cash back on my credit cards. I found out that, I could go purchase things. I remember one time buying a $500 necklace. you know, I probably still owe on that too. Like I probably still owe for some drugs if you look at my credit score. No, actually, I think all of that's gone now. But I started liquidating all my assets, and it was like an everything must go sale. And it got to the point where I had nothing else to sell. Couldn't hold down a job. Could not get enough drugs, and I met this woman who was a prostitute, and every morning she needed to get high, and it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, like clockwork, every single morning. And it got to the point where she was a good source of money. And then she couldn't find any clientele, and so I started to hook her up with people, and I was the middleman for this, and I was exploiting her. And then she disappeared, and I had these people that used to come for her, and I had these people looking for her, and I needed money, and I thought, like, maybe just this once. It's just going to be this one time. And I sold myself for the first time in my life. And it was quick money, and I got the drugs, but, like, I could never go back from that moment. Like, I was tarnished from then. I had this, like, on top of everything else that I'd done. It's like as if I didn't have enough to cope with, Then I earned my scarlet letter, that badge that I would carry for the rest of my life. Like, and it was going to be just this little secret. Like, I wasn't going to do it again. But then just the next day, just one more time. And it wasn't like I was out on the streets. I could justify it all I wanted. But it was this quiet, dark secret that I kept. And that dark secret grew into people started knowing about it. It became my way of life. And the next thing you know, I would have people coming to my mother's house and telling them, like, they're going to come. I'm an artist, and I would paint all the time. And I'd say, like, they're going to come buy some art, and I'd tell my poor mother, like, I came up with all these excuses, but what it was is, like, I was selling myself. I was prostituting. And that, like, if I didn't know enough pain before that point in my life, like, I found sufficient pain in that lifestyle. Like, the drugs changed, like, everything I was doing. Like, I didn't care about myself anymore. Like, sometimes I didn't care about bathing. I didn't care if I got beat up. The only thing that mattered was trying to get the money that I needed so I could get the next one. Like, it's like if someone's holding you underwater, all you care about is that next breath. You're not thinking about how you look. You're not thinking about how graceful you are struggling under that water. Like, I was drowning, and all I needed was that next one. I didn't know that I needed to get clean. It was obvious. It was obvious to everyone. It was obvious to me, but I didn't think that was an option. Like, the only thing I wanted to do was get high or die, and I couldn't die right. Like, I found myself in and out of the psych ward. I would try to get clean. That would last me. One time I got clean for like 5 months, and then I just gave up. I went straight back to what I was doing before, but, like, any time I tried to get clean, it was just a detox here and there, a couple days, and I couldn't stand it. Like, that feeling of my skin crawling, I didn't know how to stay clean for a day.
Now, a lot of people don't, the detox process, it's a miserable process.
Yeah.
And I explain it as, if you had the flu and you could cure it all with one pill in 1 second or one high in 1 second, there's a lot of people that would take that choice because it's the throwing up, the diarrhea, all the terrible things that go along with having a terrible flu. If you could cure that in 1 second, people would. And that's exactly the same thing with people who are going through withdrawals. They feel horrible, and they know that if they get that one little high, it'll cure that.
Yeah.
And that's that hard part of going through that cycle.
Even if it's just for a couple hours. And it's just like having the flu, except they rub you in honey and throw you in an ant pile too. So it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Now, you brought up something about justification. I think that's what happens a lot. When you first start using drugs, maybe you start off with one, and then you justified using that, so you can justify using the next, and then justify using the next. I remember I would ask people whenever they would be under arrest, I'd say, you use crack cocaine. Everybody knows the stereotype that goes along with crack cocaine. You had to make a conscious decision to start that habit? What brought you to that point? Just because I was trying to understand the psychological aspect of it. I think a lot of people look at a drug addict and they go, just another addict. Where I always wondered what was going on here to make them make that decision to do that, to put a needle in their arm or do whatever. Because let me tell you, I can handle tattoos, but watching somebody draw my blood or shoot me with a whatever vaccine, I'm like, oh, okay, that's enough for me. So I couldn't imagine every day tying your arm off and shooting up, like I've seen a lot of people do, especially now with the heroin that's going all over this county.
Yeah, it's not like I just woke up and I'm like, you know what, I want to smoke crack or I want to shoot up. It's a progression. It's the disease of addiction has a natural progression. And so, when it started out like just, smoking weed when I was in sixth grade, like, that was a big risk, that there were so many risks that came with that. And then I learned like that became a way of life, that became acceptable. Stealing things became acceptable. Doing, when I started doing pills and the designer drugs, and I hate to call it that, but that's what they called it in the pamphlet. So
yeah.
I'll just call it that. I don't need to go down because I had a tox report in the psych ward one time, and I knew like this doctor, she's like, I know what your problem is, and I'm like, yes, because the justification and rationalization, I knew she was going to tell me like, you have this diagnosis and that's why you've been getting high and we're going to give you more drugs to fix you. And I was like, okay, she's going to tell me what's wrong. And she's like, you're an addict. And she showed me my toxicology report, and there was like, it was a pretty long list. It looked like a CVS receipt. And I'm like, oh my God, there was stuff on there that I didn't even remember using, and I'm like, oh wow, and kind of had to laugh about it. But I was mad at the woman for not doing her job because there were obviously things going on inside of me that needed to be fixed by another pill. And how dare she call me an addict? It wasn't like I ever decided, like, I just want to do this or I want to do that. Or, like, I remember one time being at the store and I was like, you know what? I should start doing meth. Like, I know that it's very economical. Like, I just thinking in my head, like that. And this was towards the end of my disease where, I always needed that next thing, like that next new way to use the drug so that because it was never enough. Like, my tolerance went so high. Like, you could give me a horse tranquilizer and it would barely faze me. Like now, to this day, I have worked my liver so much in my life that when I go to get dental work, like they would usually have to shoot one cartridge of, Novocaine into someone's cheek to give them a filling. With me, it takes 4 and 5, because my liver processes things. Like I have changed myself on a chemical level from all the drugs that I've done. And it's not like I'm just like, oh yeah, I want to smoke the crack or I want to, shoot up. Even the first time that I shot up, I didn't want to because, there's a certain connotation. There's a certain, I'm not that type of addict. I don't do that. I'm above that. Mm-hmm. And so, the people that I was with, they decided like, well, she should shoot up tonight. So they put some stuff in my drink. And the next thing I know, I woke up with like bruises all over my arms.
They were shooting you up.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
And we've seen that. I think a lot of times when you hear people who use a needle for the first time, they didn't shoot themselves up. Somebody shot them up.
Yeah.
Just so you want to, we'll go to break here in a second, and then what we're doing when we get back, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you about the recovery process, and there's something very specific that I heard you talk about that I want to address. So we'll be right back.
Make sure you check out Space Cowboy Justice with your hosts, Blake Stewart and Paul Daly. We're going to be talking about interesting legal issues in the entertainment industry and everything geek. If you're into Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, comic books, we're talking about it. Coming at you from the Space Coast Podcast Studios.
Are you ready to explore the world? Travel to exotic locations and live your best life with Anytime Travel Solutions. Anytime Travel Solutions are your worldwide, unbiased concierge with access to real inventory of hotels, cruises, railroads, tours, and all of the best excursions. Anytime Travel Solutions realizes how fun it is to plan your own vacations, so we have the option to search vacations and book safely on our website, or you can visit us in our conveniently located offices in downtown Melbourne, Florida. Did you know travel is proven to benefit your health, both physically and mentally? We have 3 decades serving travelers and making dreams come true. So ask yourself, if not now, when? Call Ceci today to begin your adventure. Dial 321-779-4285 or visit anytimebookings.com. That's anytimebookings.com.
All right, we are back. Once again, we are with my friend Susan. We're talking about addiction, and obviously you've noticed that she is not on camera. We did that for a specific reason. It's not that because we want you to look at me and Chris the entire time.
Nobody wants to see that.
Yeah, nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to do that. But unfortunately, we live in a world where there's a lot of outside judgment, and we're going to talk about her recovery now and how she's developed. And we didn't want that part, the judgment part, coming out on her, and because her story is so impacting. She said at the beginning of the show that this is not the environment she usually talks in. I appreciate her coming and doing this because I think this is something that everybody needs to hear. But I wanted to get into you're now, say, 27 years old. And
now if we want to call me 27 now, that's fine.
No,
let's go with that.
Let's go with that. Okay, she's been 27 for a few years now, but when she got to the point of looking towards recovery,
I was looking towards prison time is what I was looking towards. So it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to get clean at that point. I do want to thank local law enforcement, for doing their job, because they were always the enemy my entire life. And they were the man that was trying to get me down. But because they were doing their job, like they caught me, selling drugs. They were working a few cases against me, and this was my worst nightmare. Like my biggest fear was getting busted by the police, and they came to my door, and I was so beaten. I knew, that day I was supposed to go to detox, and I knew 5 days in detox was not going to do anything, and I was, completely discouraged, and I knew, exactly what was going to happen. I'd go away for a couple days, come back, and my life would be miserable. I couldn't die. I was cursed to live this life that I had, and I had some pretty hefty charges, and they told me they were going to take me to jail, and I surrendered. For the first time in my life, I was like, okay, I can't keep fighting, and then I got to sit in jail for 35 days, and it might not sound like a lot of time, but 35 days was enough to, let me see the light. I got to see myself for who I was and for what I had become and what I had put my family through, and for some reason, 2 weeks in, my letters to my family went from being spiteful and hateful. They weren't going to bail me out. I wanted them to come up with $30,000 cash to get me out, and it wasn't going to happen. And the first couple weeks I hated them for it, and then after that I was like, wow, my letter started saying I'm so glad that I'm in here. This is going to be good for the family. I had absolutely no evidence, and we had talked about hope before. Somehow I had this seed of hope implanted in my heart, and I knew things were going to be okay. I didn't know if I was going to prison. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew this was okay. This was supposed to happen. And that was the first time in my life I had ever faced anything like that, and I had ever felt like I did. And I got out of jail. Things started looking up. I had to start from the very bottom. I had a rusted bike. I started reaching out in the community, getting help. I had no choice. You know, I had a probation officer that was telling me, like, this is what you're going to do. This is where you're going to go. You're going to go find a job. Like, I didn't want to get a job. I wanted to sleep in all day. I wanted to, you know, live off my mom. And I was scared. You know, there were severe consequences to what I had done. And I am so grateful that I had the consequences. Like, I've shaken so many police officers' hands since then because I know what those consequences have done to me. You know, I'm not saying that we need to vilify the disease of addiction. I just know that in my story, like, that's what I needed to change. And, you know, I was riding this rusty bike. I started getting little random jobs doing graphic design at different print shops. And, you know, I'd find a job here and there. And I would, you know, as a grown woman, 27 years old, riding a bike, as soon as I got paid cash, I would tell my mom, like, you need to come get it. And I would give my mom all of my money except for $1 for a cup of coffee. You know, she would get all of my money. And because I knew I couldn't be trusted. You know, I knew I couldn't trust myself. And I got a sponsor, and I started going to the sponsor's house. And she said, you know, whatever you put into your recovery is what you'll get out. Like, you chase after your recovery like you chased after your drugs. And I know how I chased. You know, I could have ran a marathon the way I was going after them. So, you know, I would get a ride out to Palm Bay from Melbourne. I would get a ride first thing in the morning. My mother had to go to work, and, you know, the sun wasn't even up, and we were on our way over there, and she would drop me off at this woman's house. And she would wake up, and I would go inside, and I would sit there, and I would wait for them to wake up, you know, and I had my books in hand, and I had the material that I'd written, my little assignments, and I waited for them to wake up, and I waited so that I could talk to her. And we would work on my recovery, and then I would wait until the end of the day and go home. And I would do this a couple times a week. Like, I would, you know, this poor woman, I was chasing her down, you know, because I knew that I needed help. I could not stand. I didn't know how to stay clean. I didn't know how to deal with myself. And all I knew was, like, those feelings of feeling like a monster, the feelings that I had ran away from for so many years, like I couldn't run away anymore. Like, I knew I had to deal with them, and I didn't know how to deal with them. So she started teaching me how to live. And I remember this one day on her desk, this was actually her neighbor, she wore all these rings. Like, she had like 1 or 2 rings on every single finger. And she took off all her rings and she left them on her desk. And she went to the store and she left me home with all of her rings. And I just looked at it and I was like, wow, this woman trusts me. Like, this was the first time in such a long time that I had been trusted. Like, you couldn't trust me with a $20 bill. And this woman left all her jewelry in front of me. And it was so profound. I got to feel like a human. You know, I got to feel like what normal people seem to feel like. You know, that feeling of being trusted, that feeling of being trustworthy, you know, and starting to gain my own dignity back. Like, that was huge for me.
No, like I said, when I heard you say that at a speech I saw you give, I was like, man, that's something to just hit. You know, because there's a lot of things I think we take for granted, that the trust, you know, the trust factor. You know, I think there's a lot of, I mean, I trust Chris pretty much.
You should.
You should. But, you know, I know if I left, you know, $100 on the table, I would come back and Chris would be like, hey, bro, you left $100 on the table, you know, whatever.
There's going to be a lot of tacos.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of tacos,
Right.
which I would be okay with,
Right.
you know, because you would share, I hope. But the idea of that simple aspect, that simple gesture of trust was something that you probably hadn't felt in years.
Yeah, I hadn't. And knowing that this woman had taken a risk, you know, and in retrospect, I can see how I was taking risks with people. You know, I was taking healthy risks. Not only was I becoming trusted, but I started trusting people. Like, I started to learn how to open up. At the beginning, when we sat down and I said, like, I feel nervous and uncomfortable, that's what I started to learn how to do. And it seems so insignificant. It's not a big deal. You know, it may not be a big deal. I'm sure you guys didn't think very much of me saying I'm nervous. People say they're nervous all the time, but for me to start to practice that, to start to acknowledge what I'm feeling, to be able to identify my feelings. My sponsor, she would ask me what I was feeling all the time, and I would get so upset because I didn't know. I didn't know what I was feeling. I was feeling something. It was uncomfortable. And she would tell me, if you don't have a word to attach, how about a color? And I'd say, I'm feeling red. And she'd ask, well, what's red like? And I'd start to tell her, Fred is uncomfortable. I feel like I'm losing it. And then we would get down to the source where it was, I felt vulnerable. I felt exposed. And that was a lot of my early recovery. Is just, that's been my entire recovery, actually, is just feeling vulnerable and exposed, but learning how to counteract that and acknowledge. She would tell me, like, look at the courage of showing up. I didn't want to show up today. Like, this is not that you guys are monsters or anything. It's very uncomfortable.
No. And we've talked about this before, because like I said, I've known you for a few years now, and ever since I've heard your story, I've constantly been telling you should write a book, you should do this, you should do that, because I honestly feel your story from beginning to end is amazing. It is a message of hope. It is a message that for parents out there who are going through this, that there is hope for that person. There is hope. Sometimes it requires tough love. Sometimes maybe it does require somebody getting locked up and figuring out what's going to happen next. But there is a message of hope in your story, and I mean, yours goes far back to when you were just a child, to the time of 27, to that those first steps into recovery, to getting that first moment where somebody trusts you, to now you're clean for how many years now?
7 years.
7 years. And in that time, what have you done since your recovery for yourself?
Oh, since I got clean, I've gone back to school. I had this mentor that just kept telling me, you need to go back to school. And I said, this was early on. I mean, I'm still, I was just kicking dope. And he's telling me, go apply for school. You need to go back. You need to, acknowledge your potential. And I thought, what potential? Like, these are all the strikes against me. And he would tell me, like, you're not defined by those things that you did. Your disease does not define you. That was a life changer when I heard that. They told me that I'm not responsible for my disease. Like, I'm responsible for my recovery. I'm responsible for making the amends that I have to make the wrongs that I did right. I'm responsible for all that in my recovery, but they made it very clear that the things that I did when I was chasing after drugs were not me. Like, those things were me acting on my disease. Like, that's what a diseased addict does. And I'm not unique. Like, my lows are not any worse than anybody else's, because it's the feelings attached. It's not so much those activities, it's the feelings. It's the feelings of complete desperation. And learning in recovery how to acknowledge that, how to just let go, because the things that I did, the prostitution and stealing and selling drugs and all these things, like, there's a definite stigma. There's a stigma attached to being an addict, and it's hard to shake that. And I want, the society's not going to forgive me, and society has its own, they see this list of things that I've experienced, and I'm going to wear that scarlet letter for the rest of my life. Like, it doesn't matter what society says. Like, I still have to live by some societal conditioning. But the biggest deal for me is to let go of that stuff myself. And what I learned how to do is just, go to a group of people and tell them what I'm going through. The first time that someone asked me to speak, and I didn't know what to say. The only thing I knew was, like, I had been doing these dirty things. And it was eating my lunch, like, it was just eating me up inside, and I didn't know what to talk about. All I knew was there was this thing screaming inside of my head, like, just let it out. And in front of a room full of 60 people, this was another one of those, like, leaps of faith. Like, I had never known that you could just get completely honest in front of people, and I told them. I just opened up and I told them what I had done. And expecting, like, people say, well, love you till you love yourself. And I thought, I'm going to call you on that, And expecting people to judge me and, like, roll their eyes or just kind of, like, look at me like a leper. And what people did instead was, like, they stood up and they hugged me. And men and women both said, like, thank you so much for sharing what you shared. Thank you for opening up. And that was the kicker in my life. Like, I learned, I never knew that my life would turn out how it did, but I found out that my biggest liabilities have become my greatest assets. Like, I can take every single one of those things that look like a strike against me, and I can use them for the positive. I can tell the next person who's suffering, like, hey, I've been through this, and there's hope on the other side. Like, I've gone back to school. In the fall, I'm going to start my master's degree, and, like, my goal is to get more college degrees than I have felony convictions. So I've still got once I get my master's, we'll even them out. But that's one of the things that I've done in recovery
No, I random question. Several years ago, you told me this story. We had only known each other a short amount of time when you told me, that you were a recovering addict and all that. Knowing that I was in law enforcement, was that like a weird conversation to have with me?
It was so cool. I went home and I called my sponsor. I'm like, you have no idea what I told this cop. Like it was so neat, and I still brag about it. I tell people like it blows my mind. Like, and you're not the only one that I've made friends with. Like just it's completely different than I ever learned. And I can see how someone is just doing their job and trying to do a good job and trying to do better for the community. I never understood that until I got to experience what it was like, to have, someone with a badge save my life.
No, and I can tell you from the law enforcement side of it, I hate telling people that their family member is dead from an overdose or whatever. And I can remember working over in Canaveral, and me and my buddy Pete, we go to this overdose, and it was this girl that we knew. She had to be 21, 22, and she was this beautiful girl, and we were both just like stunned that she had OD'd, and found out a short time later that her brother had gotten her addicted to pills, and he felt so guilty about it that he OD'd himself. He killed himself. And I couldn't imagine being a parent who lost both their children within probably a 5 or 6 month span because of addiction. And my thought process at that point, and that was 16 years ago, was what do we do to educate people? What do we do to help people? And not educate them in the DARE way, because the DARE way was don't do drugs. We don't really tell you why. We just tell you don't do drugs. But how do we tell people what it does to the body? How do we tell somebody what it does to the mind? How do we tell somebody to not do something when most of the time that we're not there with them all the time. I'm not there to hold somebody's hand all the time. That's a decision you have to make as an adult, or I should say an adult decision, when you start using. Just like when you decide you want to recover, I can't make that decision for Susan. Susan has to make that decision for themselves. I can lead you to water so many times, but if you choose not to drink, you're choosing not to drink. I can't make you recover, and that's that's one of the difficult things for me is, wanting to stop all the overdoses, wanting to see people go to recovery, but I can't take them there and make that decision for them,
Yeah, you can't force anyone to get clean. I know that firsthand. And just by telling them like what it does to the body, you could tell me all day long, that rice is bad for me and fried things, and tell me what they'll do to my arteries and my blood sugar, and I can learn about all the consequences. I'll still leave here and go get some sushi because it's absolutely delicious.
Yeah, no, Chris and
we will disagree on the sushi, but
deep fried Oreos, Chris and I are in.
No,
okay,
I don't eat deep fried Oreos.
What?
I know, it's surprising.
Deep fried anything.
But
What?
You did bring up tacos.
Do I know
earlier,
you?
so.
Do I even know you right now? Like,
I'm not a deep fried Oreo guy.
Is there such a thing? Is there such a thing? Do you like deep fried Oreos?
I don't want to talk about that publicly, but I'll confess some things, but I'm not ready for that yet. But you could tell me all day about the consequences of eating a certain food, but I may need to eat that, and sometimes it's just for pleasure, but if I start overeating, you can keep telling me about the consequences, but we need to get to the point of like, why am I overeating? Why am I using this drug? Why am I reaching outside of myself to feel different? What's going on inside of me? And no one can tell me when I'm ready to look at those things. But the cool thing about society today is that we've opened up this conversation. It's the problem is obvious. We've opened up a conversation about mental health, about addiction, about these struggles that people have. And myself as a recovering addict, what my responsibility I found to be is to let people know what I'm going through. I can't tell the next person you can't do this and this is what it's going to do to you, because I used, in spite of the negative consequences, most of my life. What I can do is say, like, I never felt like I fit in, and I wanted to cover that up. I never could pinpoint like what the emptiness was inside of me, and I covered that up. And I can tell people about how I got through it. And it's not, pain is a universal language. Sentiments are universal. You may have never used a drug in your life, but you felt pain. You felt some human things.
Absolutely.
And there's people that are struggling that have never picked up a drug. You
No.
know, so as humans, if we talk about the things that we're going through, if we open up and become vulnerable, not only can we help ourselves, but we might save somebody's life.
No, absolutely. Conversation is the reason why we do this podcast. You know, I think sometimes we shock Jesse with some of the people that we bring in to talk, because sometimes we get pretty heavy, pretty deep.
Sorry, Jesse.
But, you know, one of the things I've realized is that I think people are afraid of offending others so much that they don't want to have conversations, or something's not pretty. You know, drug addiction isn't pretty, so they don't want to discuss it. You know, I know.
Or they just want to pretend it can't happen or it doesn't happen. Kind of like what we were talking about before. I mean, it can happen to any family or any child, no matter how you raise them or what parenting steps you take. So I think we have a society that likes to just stick their head in the sand and pretend, oh, it's not happening. It's not going to happen here.
No,
so
no.
I'm going to ostrich it up.
Absolutely.
And it's not going to happen.
Well,
and that's when it does happen, because now you've...
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things I think is interesting is there's a lot of people I know who their child died of an overdose, but the family would rather say that they committed suicide than died of an overdose, because suicide in the public mindset is a mental illness that led to that. And they don't look at drug addiction the same way. There's the stigmas that go along with drug addiction, but a lot of it is mental. It's a lot of that, what you've been talking about, opening up, whatever that hole is that you're trying to fill, or whatever. And I know there's different ways people are dealing with it, not only through obviously you have to address what's going on here and what's going on here, but some people use yoga, they use running, they use other ways that they're trying to fill that hole through positive means. We've talked before, you know, I started getting involved in charity work because I needed to find an even keel for all the negative that I was seeing. I needed to have an equal positive to keep me balanced, because I think that's what gets a lot of law enforcement officers disgruntled as they go further into their career, is they block out a lot of that stuff, and they just see the typical, well, just another shitbag, or just another whatever, blah, 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 you know, and that's how they talk. But because they're not balancing it out. A lot of guys I talk to don't have a hobby outside of what they do at the job. And, you know, I think that's why law enforcement divorce rate is so high. I think cops bottle up a lot of things, so then that communication dies down. There's a lot of things that are very similar to where it causes gaps. And, you know, with part of your recovery, like you said, you've gone back to school. You started doing things that personal development, getting those degrees that, you know, you want to have more degrees than felonies is awesome. That should be like your tagline right there. When you do it, you know, like that should be it. But what other things can you suggest if you know somebody that's struggling right now, or somebody who, you know, maybe there's a family member who's going to tag this or send this to a family member and say, hey, watch this show. You're not alone. There's somebody who is just like you who got out of it. Like, what would you say to, if you could talk to every addict in the world right now, what would you tell that person?
I'd tell them there's hope. There's hope, and, you know, I truly believe that you could stop using drugs and find a new way of life. I've seen it happen to me, and I thought I was the bottom of the barrel. You know, there was absolutely no hope. If you ask my family members, like they talk about me like I'm a miracle, and I know that I am. You know, I know it's a miracle for me to sit here and be able to talk about what I've gone through, you know, and unapologetically be my true self and let you guys know what I've been through. And not everybody has to do that. Like, getting clean doesn't mean you have to go, you know, confess things to everyone, or, you know, sit behind a microphone and get super vulnerable. This is what helps me.
Yeah.
You know, this is definitely what helps me. But just, you know, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to have made mistakes. It's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to have absolutely shattered every dream that you have in your life, because if you have a beating heart, there's still hope, and that's a huge deal.
No, and so I'll end it with this. So when I went to go see Susan speak, I met her mom for the first time, and it was funny because she's up there doing her thing, and I'm sitting with her mom, and her mom's like, I'm so proud of her. I am so proud of what she's turned into. I'm so proud of this. And in my mind, I was like, this is a concept of hope, that relationships can be restored, friendships can be restored, life can be restored. And you've done all that. You've restored your relationship with your family. You're an intricate part of your brother's life, your mom's life. You have a good job.
I got a couple of them.
You got a couple of good jobs, but you got good jobs. You work with good people. You know good people. You associate with everybody of all walks of life. You speak. You inspire. You do all the things that a leader should do, and that is a very uncomfortable role for you. But it's a role that you're very good at. And I don't know if you understand that, but after watching you speak and seeing how you impacted all those people in that room, I was like, that's the story that we have to have on the show. That is the story that I honestly 100% say you need to write a book and you need to put that out, because your story is a story that will help parents, will help kids, will help addicts, will help see that future. And I'm sure Chris agrees with me because he's doing the stare and the nodding. So, but as we end this show, I'm going to tell you, think about that. When you finish your degree, you get that stuff done, because and keep doing stuff like this, because I can't tell your story. I can give people that little glimpse, but I don't bring it like you bring it, because it's you. That's your story. Like I said, I've told your story to, I can't tell you how many people I've told your story to, because I want to give those families hope. And I say, there's this person, and I tell them your story. And it's just that snippet, but it's enough to maybe make that person go, okay, I'm not giving up today. I'm not giving up today, Chris, what are your final thoughts here, bro?
Susan, I just want to thank you for coming on and giving us your story.
Thanks for having me.
Like you said before, it's very vulnerable and it's difficult, but maybe it helps you, and maybe there's somebody out there listening, or somebody's got a family member, and maybe there's some stuff there that they can use to help them. And again, I just want to thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me, and thanks for creating a safe space for people
no
like
worries.
me.
No worries. Like I said, we know. I just appreciate everything you've done and everything you continue to do. And with that, Jesse, I believe we are wrapping this bad boy up. How about that, bro? Thumbs up from Jesse. Okay, good to go.
Time to get some tacos.
All right. See y'all later.